morning. Being here feels like visiting an old friend because I started my career in finance. After I graduated in econometrics, you get pulled into the sector at that time. And then that was in the Netherlands, and then I immigrated to the US over a decade ago, and I did my second master's in sustainability, and now I'm a researcher. So at the beginning of my career, I thought I had left finance behind me. But as it turns out, my research in what is necessary for people to truly live sustainably has led me right back at the heart of our economic system and finance. So my research started with, can we do the next slide? With the question of what is now the Club of Rome. At that time, in the 70s, it was a group of thinkers that came together in Rome and asked one another, how is it that despite all our innovation and progress, we have these recurring problems? Poverty, pollution, resource scarcity, disease, conflict, financial instability. Presumably these things are interrelated, thank you, but how? So this group of thinkers is now called the Club of Rome, and they asked this question to a group of MIT scientists in the middle. And to come up with an answer, they created a first-of-its-kind world model. First of its kind because it was a new modeling technique at the time, system dynamics modeling. Now, you are in finance, so you're familiar with the more econometric models, I assume. But they often assume a lot of implicit constancy, linearity, but also general, just the relationships between variables. Most of them are exogenous. In system dynamics, all variables can interrelate. They're all endogenous. And with that, you can model things like nonlinear jumps or implosions. And I've always felt that that's a better way to model complex systems like our society and our economy and indeed our financial sector. So, as the MCs already said, what they found was, and it surprised the authors at first as well, that the underlying root cause there was indeed one, and it was the pursuit of growth. That which the world sees as the solution, they said, is the root cause of all these persistent problems. So they wrote that up in a book called The Limits to Growth, which at the time was a bestseller, but you may have never heard of it because it was very effectively buried. So that's why I decided just a couple of years ago, given this unappealing prospect of collapse, let's see how these scenarios, because that's what they did a scenario analysis. I'm assuming everybody knows what that is. Let's see how that aligns with empirical data. We have a few decades worth by now. So that was published in Yale's Journal of Industrial Ecology, and I wrote it up later in a book together with some other findings that I will talk about today. And these are the headlines. So it gives you a general idea of the coverage. Editors love the word collapse because it's very dramatic. Collapse doesn't mean the end of humanity. It just means a steep decline from a previous peak, so it's undesirable. And also, my research and that of the Limits to Growth authors was not necessarily a prediction of doom. It was more nuanced and ultimately more optimistic. So let me talk to you about that a little bit. So this is an impression of the Limits to Growth scenarios. So you know, I assume how scenario analysis works. You have certain assumptions and then you run the model to see what happens. This model is not meant to make point predictions. It's to understand global dynamics. So all the variables here, industrial output, food pollution, food production, population, there were other variables as well. They're all global. So the top two are business as usual, so no additional assumptions on top of historical averages. And those both end in collapse. The only difference between them is how much fossil fuels we have left, because there's uncertainty there. So it's a very highly optimistic assumption in business as usual too. It doesn't matter, they both end in collapse. So it's not true that this was the case for all scenarios. Notably, in stabilized world, SW, most declines are avoided. But that one does have additional assumptions. It is assumed there that society makes a shift in priorities and redirect resources away from industrial output growth towards the variable of human services, health and education, and also resource efficiency and pollution abatement. And in that, there, we still get to this top in well-being, the top that you see everywhere, and where we are right now, by the way, we're at the top right now. But then in the business as usual, it goes steeply down. And in the stabilized world, we maintain what we have. There were no scenarios where growth could continue indefinitely. So this is what I found. The dashed purple line is the empirical data. So firstly, close alignment with all of the scenarios, and that's because they haven't diverged much yet, because we're at the top. So to me, that is one of my first conclusions is then that we should heed the message of limits to growth. I've seen many models in my life, as have you, I assume. I don't know another model that was this accurate decades into the future. So that means we should listen to what it tells us about global dynamics. And as I said, there was no scenario where growth could continue forever. I think this is important because it frames the discussion. Our choice is not whether to keep growing or not. It's whether the end of growth comes by design or disaster. Either we choose our own limits or we will have them forced upon us. So, and that opportunity, that window of opportunity to make that decision still is closing fast because we are right now at the top. Once we go down, there's no stopping it. So how do we get to where we avoid that steep decline? How do we realign ourselves with SW, something like that? Well, what happens there? What is that? What is that society that shifts resources away from industrial output growth towards human services and pollution abatement? That's what I call a well-being economy, where the goal of GDP growth is replaced, not complemented by this people, planet, profit doesn't work. It's replaced by human and ecological well-being. The goal of the economy becomes meeting human needs within planetary boundaries. So in this well-being economy, all people, all parties, so not just government, not charity or some small citizen action with recycling, but government policies, business activities, and citizen behavior are all aimed at that goal of human and ecological well-being. And we're not anti-growth, but we're more selective about it. If it contributes to well-being, we'll do it. And if not, why should we? So, as I said, the time is running out, and you don't need the limits to growth to tell you that. This is very clear by now. Real scientists, I'm just an economist, but real scientists have been warning us about this for years now, and they're seriously ringing the alarm bells right now. They say we're at tipping points. We're close to tipping points, if not already right in them when it comes to climate, for example. But we have the planetary boundaries, and we've transgressed 6 of them. I'm assuming you know that. I'm assuming you know we've never had more carbon emissions than this year. We're at an all-time high for fossil fuel use. We're at an all-time high even for coal use. So this is exactly what the Club of Rome intuited. We have progress, clearly. And yet, we see no slowing down in most of the pollution, like water scarcity, chemical pollution, plastic. We have seen efficiency increases in how we create energy with the carbon, but we are still at an all-time high. And ultimately, what that comes down to is, in our current economic system, we will do what is possible. But to stay within the safe operating space, to preserve life on Earth as we know it, we have to do what is necessary. And if that was possible within the current economic system, it would have happened by now. And listen, I know changing our economic system sounds like a lot of effort, and it is. Dealing with the aftermath of ecosystem collapse is also a lot of effort. So unfortunately, that one is guaranteed. So it's a lot of effort, but it is, in fact, possible. We have the alternatives. We have GDP alternatives. And that's necessary. We need better indicators. By itself, it's not enough. We also need to let go of growth however we measure it. And we have those models too. They all fall under the well-being economy paradigm, as I call it. And you're probably familiar with some of them. We have post-growth, regenerative economics, full circle, the donut, of course, which I really like. I often talk about the concept of enough. I like that word because it has two meanings. It's enough as in the bottom, enough for each. That's the social foundation, the inner ring of the donut. But we also have enough as in enough. We can't go further than this. And that's the outer ring of this is what the planet can sustain for us. And within that, we have, of course, the safe operating space where we need to stay in. There's also degrowth, which is a pathway towards this well-being economy, because right now we're addicted to growth. We don't really like the outcomes of the system, but we feel we're stuck in it, and degrowth is a very clear policy to break that addiction, to get us to that better place of a well-being economy. We also have this specifically for finance. So some of these resources here, the Club of Rome is still doing something. Jennifer Wilkins in New Zealand is very active with it. We have the Capitals Institute. We have the Arqueta Institute, which was recently launched. I think Matthew Orsak is here today as well. He's a co-founder. So we have all these things. And listen, I know there are many resources out there on sustainable finance. The difference with these resources and those, which every sustainability department in any kind of financial institution puts out, is that those latter still work within the current economic paradigm. So the things in there, they will be in these resources as well, but they go further. They talk about the more fundamental paradigm shifting questions, like what is investment? What is ownership? Is investment a claim to future profits? Or is it a commitment to our common future? Is ownership the right to do with something as you please, including exploiting it until it's wasted? Or is it a responsibility of care? And if the latter, how do we make our structures reflect that better? So that's the kind of things you could be wrestling with, depending on where you are. In risk analysis, in assessments, how do we move from this relative ESG assessment to the absolute limits of the planet and social foundations? Is fiduciary duty demanding lower returns investments now to avoid massive future losses? I used to be an economic policy advisor at the Dutch Central Bank, working on fiscal policy. And I imagine now I would have said part of my job is probably to look in how we can safeguard livelihoods in a fiscally responsible way, regardless of whether the economy is growing or not. So the answers to these questions are not neatly laid out in these resources, but they will help you find one or two questions for you to grapple with and then build that out wherever you are in the system. And you wouldn't be alone anymore. This movement, this kind of thinking is growing. You can see it in government, you can see it especially in academia. And it has spread now to UN organizations like the IPCC and others. The Poverty of Growth is a book that came out by the UN Rapporteur on Human Rights, Oliver Schutte, who was like, well, you know, this idea of poverty alleviation having to come through growth is actually keeping a lot of people in poverty as well. So it's not just the West either. It's most popular right now in Europe, but it is around the world. There was a bestseller in Japan by Kohei Saito, which says very similar things. So if you look at this Ngram, which is Google Ngram scans a vast amount of literature, and then you can search for terms, and you see that this green growth is now going down and is now below degrowth, which has been rising, as have planetary boundaries. And the reason is simply because if you look at the data, which especially people in academia do, you just see that green growth is not working. It would be nice if it did, but this idea that we can keep growing GDP without all the negative externalities that we don't want, it's just not in the data. It's not happening. There is some decoupling, including in my country, in my home country, in the Netherlands. We have some absolute decoupling, and it's nowhere near us staying within our fair share of the Paris Agreement. No country is anywhere near that. It's just not in the data. So business and finance are catching up to this as well. Financial Times, Harvard Business Review, Bloomberg, World Economic Forum, they're all seriously discussing this. It's not mainstream yet, but it is breaking into the mainstream. It's no longer fringe either. And we see that these things are also widely popular. These policies that are part of the degrowth framework, like universal basic incomes to safeguard livelihoods, are carrying a majority support in all over the world. There's variation in geography and as well as generations, but in general, people like those policies. They also agree with the underlying values as a duty of care, that kind of thing. So lastly, I want to talk about the opportunity, because this is often missed. We know the imperative, we know the urgency. We also know we have the capabilities, we have the policies, we can do it with current technologies already. So we should, and we can, but will we? I get asked that a lot. I don't know. No one knows the future. But I do know that we want it, because this is often missed. We would want to do this even if we were not facing ecosystem collapse, because we would be happier. What I'm proposing is sometimes misunderstood. When I say letting go of growth, people hear, okay, let's go in a permanent recession, people. And it's not a capitulation to grim necessity. It's something we'd want to do anyway. Because this current economy does a poor job in meeting our social and spiritual needs. And social science is very clear that once our basic needs are securely met, and I agree, if they aren't, we are selfish and violent even. But once they're securely met, our needs have become much more social and spiritual. We need things like a sense of community, a sense of purpose. And that's hard to satisfy in the current economic system. Every curious inquiry online, every social connection is monetized. And so this is what it comes down to. I often put it like this, that we would have less stuff, that's true, but we would have more of what we really need, which is connection. That's what a well-being economy delivers. Physical sufficiency, social abundance, and spiritual wealth. What can I do? I work in this big global system, and we have these big global challenges. Feels pretty overwhelming. So I get the question a lot, like, what can I even do? Well, actually, there's a very clear place to start. You. You have to start there. You have to start by deconstructing this narrative that we've been told in this current growthist system, you are a selfish maximizer. Impacts on others you discount as externalities. We're doomed to exploit our commons, so I guess the best thing we can hope for is technology to save us from ourselves. And I propose that maybe there's this other narrative that fits you better. Instead of this story of what I call the story of separation, I propose the story of interdependence, in which we are nature. And once our needs are securely met, we rejoice in contributing to this web of life that we feel we're all part of. Once you've healed from that story of separation, how it has limited you, then you go back out in the system and see where you can build out that new narrative. If you don't start from there, you will just keep applying fixes to the old system, and ultimately you will not change nothing. So you have to start at the narrative level. It cannot stay there, of course, otherwise you won't be effective either. But how you do that then is you just find what works best for you. It doesn't matter, you find your sphere of influence. It doesn't matter where you are in the power hierarchy. CEOs are very dictated by the system, so have no illusions about that. You always have influence. And if you can, connect with one or two other people in your tribe. So your company is a tribe, but also your local community is a tribe. Connect with people and see what you can do there. You do not need to convince the majority. You will not succeed in that. Don't even try that. Connect with one or two people. If you're lucky and you can find 4 or 5, you can move mountains. But 1 or 2 people is enough, and you start to co-create things that make sense to you within the system. And then my advice is to stand prepared, which is something that sustainability advocates don't always say. They typically end with something like, the time to act is now. And it is. But the thing is, I've worked in finance too, and we're not the ones to jump on barricades. And about a year ago, I think it was, I gave another talk, and someone came up after me, an investment banker, and he said, I think I agree with you. But I think if I do what you're telling me I need to do, all the impact I will have made is that I lose my job. And that's a legitimate fear. If you move too fast, you place yourself out of the system. And this system, very purposefully, has made your livelihoods dependent on that job. And also you won't be effective within that system if you're working on the outside. So go push the system, build out that new narrative, try to hold that tension of working in a system, the narrative of which you do not fully share, and do what you can within that system. And know that this is how social tipping points work, because those exist as well. How system change happens is people start building out this new narrative very disjointly at first. And over time, they form connections until a critical mass is reached. And that's typically around 20 or 25%. And then the process becomes self-reinforcing. And only then does the majority come along. Will that happen? I don't know. But I do know that if this economic systems change happens, it will have been because people like are gathered here today will have contributed to that change in their own way. So, thank you for listening.